Why did humans create leaders? 1. The dawn of power and a human paradox. Imagine a group of people living tens of thousands of years ago in the midst of a vast and perilous wilderness. In that primitive world, there were no kings, there were no presidents, there was no government, no police force, and certainly no standing army. They were just a small group of people bound together to hunt, gather, protect their children, and try to survive each day. But then, one day, they stood at a crossroad, forced to make a life or death decision. A large herd of animals was moving north. A dark storm was brewing on the western horizon. At the same time, the tracks of a group of strangers carrying weapons had just appeared near their traditional hunting ground. The entire community had to decide what to do next: flee, defend, or attack. What would happen if each person in the group wanted to go in a completely different direction? Who would have the authority to make the final decision? And more importantly, why would the others accept and bow to that decision? This little story leads us to one of the greatest paradoxes in anthropology and history. Why does a species capable of independent thought, yearning for freedom, and inherently disliking being controlled by others, like humans, continuously create individuals with the power to lead and dominate them? Throughout the flow of history, on any continent humans have set foot on, we have constantly created chiefs, chieftains, generals, patriarchs, kings, and countless other forms of leadership. So, did leadership emerge because humans truly needed a guiding hand to survive, or just because some ambitious individuals always craved to rise and hold power? The truth is, the history of power is a complex blend of both these elements. 2. The first leaders were nothing like kings. When hearing the word leadership, the modern mind often automatically draws an image of a ruler standing at the pinnacle, pointing fingers and forcing everyone below to absolutely submit. But the political history of humanity did not begin with thrones. Anthropological studies on small-scale hunter-gatherer societies show that early humans lived in communities with an extremely high level of equality. Leadership in this era was momentary, flexible, and much more limited. In a primitive tribe, a person might step up to lead in a specific situation, but they absolutely did not have the authority to give orders in every aspect of life. For example, the most skillful hunter who understood the behavior of the prey the best would command the entire hunt. The one who knew the terrain by heart would step up to decide the migration route. An older, experienced, and wise person would be invited to mediate quarrels, and a warrior covered in scars would take command when the village was attacked. However, as soon as the beast fell or the threat passed, that temporary power instantly evaporated. The commander of yesterday returned to being a normal member, sitting around sharing meat and lighting fires like everyone else. At this stage, leadership was a necessary role for survival, not an entrenched position. 3. The problem of the crowd and the power of knowledge. All troubles began to appear when the size of the group increased. If 3 people discussed where to go forage for berries together, reaching a consensus was very easy. But what if that group swelled to 30 people, 100 people, or 1,000 people? At this point, every single individual in the crowd brought along different goals, different amounts of information, complex family relationships, and completely conflicting personal interests. If every decision, no matter how small, had to be debated until everyone nodded in agreement, the whole group would be completely paralyzed. They would react too slowly to changes in the environment and certainly face death. Leadership emerged precisely to solve this collective action problem. The leader acted as a focal point, helping to turn hundreds of individual chaotic wills into a single, sharp, collective action. Furthermore, In an environment where death always lurked, knowledge was the ultimate power. Who knew exactly which water source would not dry up in the dry season? Who remembered which plant was poisonous, which one could cure a fever? Who knew the safe way to cross a raging river? The person possessing those priceless blocks of survival knowledge naturally became a beacon for the community to cling to. People voluntarily listened and followed them, not because of the fear of the whip, but because listening to them meant their families had a higher chance of survival. This was the most primitive and pure form of leadership based on competence. 4. 2 paths to power, prestige, and dominance. When studying the dynamics of power formation, scientists outline 2 opposing paths, the path of prestige and the path of dominance. Prestige is the sparkling power an individual receives when the community voluntarily honors them. A person with prestige is usually talented, highly knowledgeable, and always willing to share food and help others. When they contribute to the group, they receive respect in return. Respect gives their voice weight. A weighty voice helps them organize larger activities, and their prestige continues to rise. It is a perfect loop of voluntarism. But history does not only have bright colors. The second path to power is called dominance. An individual can completely bring others to their knees simply by sowing fear. The dominator might be the physically strongest, the one possessing the most violent henchmen, or the one monopolizing the only water source in the village. That person is ready to ruthlessly punish anyone who dares to speak out in opposition. The core difference here is, with prestige, people follow you because they want to. But with dominance, people submit to you because they fear the consequences of refusal. Throughout historical dynasties, the power of great rulers was often a sophisticated blend of both these elements. They cloaked themselves in a mantle of benevolence to gather prestige while grasping the sword of the military to deter betrayal. But there is an interesting point. In small tribes, humans were not weak in the face of those who wanted to dominate. When an individual started acting bossy, the community would use social pressure to punish them. Starting with ridicule, boycotts, refusal to cooperate, and if that person was too aggressive, the whole group might secretly ally to expel or even kill the tyrant. This shows that humans have the ability to build hierarchies, but we also possess the cooperative instinct to overthrow dictatorships. 5. Hunting, war, and crisis, the crucible of power. We often assume that history is the story of outstanding individuals seizing power themselves and forcing the masses to follow. But in reality, this process often goes in the opposite direction. It is the followers who create the leader. Take the example of hunting giant beasts, like mammoths. A large hunt required the precise coordination of dozens of people. Who surrounded, who distracted, who threw the finishing spear. If everyone acted independently, the plan would collapse. The community was forced to proactively delegate command to the most outstanding individual to coordinate the battle. This need became absolute when war broke out. Amidst fire and bullets, the speed of decision-making was 1,000 times more important than democratic debates. When the enemy was charging with spears, the village could not sit in a meeting to vote. They needed someone to yell out, "Who defends the left? Who covers the right? Who takes the children to hide?" A wartime leader was born. Ecological crises played a similar role. Droughts, floods, famines, or epidemics required an iron hand to allocate scarce resources and keep the community from crumbling. But this was the turning point. A general, or a person who rescued the community through a crisis, would accumulate massive prestige. And when the crisis passed, what would happen if that leader refused to return the power? Temporary power began to solidify into permanent privilege. 6. Agriculture and the granary. The power game changes. The true shift in human history began with the agricultural revolution. When humans abandoned the nomadic lifestyle to settle, cultivate, and domesticate animals, the old rules of power were instantly torn apart. Land became the most precious asset. The population exploded, and most importantly, food could be stockpiled for the first time. You could not keep deer meat for more than a few days, but you could fill storage pits with wheat to eat slowly over many years. The granary created an entirely new and terrifying kind of power. A life or death question was raised. Who would hold the key to the granary? Initially, the community might entrust this task to a prestigious individual, acting as a diligent manager. These people, called big men by anthropologists, often used their ability to accumulate food to host large feasts, give gifts, and cultivate a network of allies. Through generosity, they traded for political power. But when an individual or a family monopolized control of the granary, the water source, and the trade routes, everything began to corrupt. During lean seasons or years of crop failure, the lives of hundreds of other families depended entirely on the distribution decisions of the granary keeper. The position of a community servant transformed into the position of a ruler. The tool of resource distribution turned into a tool to coerce submission. 7. Theocracy and the birth of the hereditary system. However, violence and economic control were still not enough to secure the throne for the long term. As society became more complex, power needed an invisible armor: legitimacy. Leaders began to find ways to link their power with the spiritual world. They claimed to be messengers of the gods, the embodiment of ancestors, the only ones holding the secret rituals to summon rain, shift the wind, and maintain the order of the universe. When the people believed that rebelling against the chief was equivalent to rebelling against the gods, that throne became inviolable. And then, a difficult problem arose. When this talented leader died, who would replace them? Initially, the choice might have been based on competence, but the children of the old chief always possessed superior starting points. They were born into luxury, inherited the network of power, held the secrets of management, and were supported by the allies of their father. Gradually, society accepted the rule of heredity, not exactly because they were forced, but because a clear succession helped prevent the bloodbaths of power struggles every time dynasties changed. Stability was traded for the fact that the community had to grit its teeth and accept a cruel or incompetent leader, simply because he was lucky enough to be born from the right bloodline. The concept of class officially took shape. Society split in two: the ruling aristocracy and the ruled commoners. 8. The state, taxes, and the colossal ruling apparatus. As wars between territories grew increasingly fierce, centralized power was further consolidated. A community with a tight military organization always crushed fragmented groups. To maintain military strength, the leader demanded absolute control. But a king managing tens of thousands of subjects could not personally go to the fields to plow or gather every single spear by hand. Around the throne, a colossal apparatus began to form: a standing army, a priestly class, scribes, judges, and tax collectors. For this machine to operate, the system of taxation and corvée labor was born. The people were forced to submit a portion of their labor and property to feed the center of power. At this point, the leader no longer existed as a solitary individual. Power had incarnated into a grand, cold entity operating on its own principles. That was the birth of the state. The king might pass away, but the administrative and military apparatus would continue to grind through time. 9. Symbols, law, and the problem of controlling power. Along with the state, law emerged. In a small community, the village chief could mediate disputes. But in an empire of millions of strangers, order could only be maintained through laws, courts, and punishments. Humans gave up the freedom to resolve conflicts themselves through personal violence, to entrust that exclusive right of violence to the state. Simultaneously, the leader rose to become the supreme spiritual symbol of an entire nation. When millions of people could not know the faces of one another, grand ceremonies, a glittering crown, a flag, or monumental architecture helped them share a psychological anchor, feeling that they belonged to a great imagined community. However, the evolution of power brought an ironic conclusion. The creation of leaders helped humanity solve the problem of coordination, the problem of protection, and resource management, but it directly spawned the most terrifying problem of human civilization. Who would control that coordinator? What prevented the protector from using the army to slaughter their own people? What prevented the resource manager from stealing everything for their own pockets? How could an individual be given enough power to protect society, but not enough power to turn that society into slaves? To save ourselves from the monsters we created, humans continued an untiring journey of innovation. From ancient councils of elders, we invented laws, constitutions, parliaments, elections, independent courts, and the principle of the separation of powers, all aimed at a single purpose: to lock the power of the leader firmly inside a cage of mechanisms. 10. Conclusion. Returning to the initial question, why did humans create leaders? The truth is, in the early days of the dawn of humanity, we never intended to create someone to rule over us. Our ancestors simply needed someone to point the way in a storm, a coordinator to take down a mammoth, and a guide to lead the community past the abysses of extinction. But as the wheel of history turned, as resources became more massive and wars grew bloodier, those temporary helpful roles condensed into positions. Positions sublimated into status, status corrupted into privilege, and privilege fossilized into hereditary thrones. However, the greatest thing about humanity does not lie in the fact that we knew how to create power. The most astonishing thing is that throughout the long history of blood and tears, humans have never given up the fight, continuously designing smarter systems to restrain power and force it to return to serving its original purpose, the survival and happiness of the community. If you were sent back in time to a tribe thousands of years ago and given the right to choose a chieftain, who would you vote for? The physically strongest, the one possessing the most wealth, the most ruthless warrior, or a wise person you trusted the most? And more importantly, where would you set the boundaries for the power of that person before it became a threat? Please leave your perspective in the comments section. And if you want to continue the journey of discovering how tiny tribal chieftains gradually manipulated history, transforming into kings and emperors of the great empires that ruled the world, hit the subscribe button to catch the next story.